My name is Ceciel Nieuwenhout and I'm working at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands and specifically at the Groningen Center of Energy Law. Within promotion, we did the legal and regulatory research. So let's start at the beginning. Currently, the legal framework for offshore cables exists on 3 levels: international law, EU law, and national law. I won't go into the details of what is currently the legal framework, but I will tell you that the current legal framework is not designed with a meshed offshore grid in mind. So for example, the law is very much oriented towards the national borders, the national countries, rather than regional orientation. There is currently no governance structure for a meshed offshore grid. Of course, this is more complicated than just single radial cables. The market rules are based on interconnectors or on wind connector, but not on wind connection, but not both at the same time, which is the purpose of an offshore grid. And the operational rules, for example, are based on AC technology rather than DC technology, which is also meant to be for the offshore grids. So what you can see is that certain things need to be changed in order to get a meshed offshore grid off the ground. So, do we then need a common legal framework? Some people say no, because coastal states can arrange these problems ad hoc when it is necessary. They can solve the problems as they come along. Or, no, we don't need a big legal framework because we can focus on the short-term projects first and indeed make solutions when they are necessary. On the other hand, you can say yes, because together the states can reap the benefits of cooperation, and the earlier they do so, the more benefits they can get. Also yes, because investors in an offshore grid need a stable legal framework. In our research, they have indicated that they sometimes doubt whether they should invest because they don't know whether the legal framework is already stable enough. So it can hold back investors if they don't trust the legal framework yet. And yes, because it takes a very long time to develop the legal framework that we need in 2030, when the grid becomes more complicated. So that's a reason to start already now, even though it might not be necessary yet, it will be necessary in 10 years, for example. And it takes some time to develop the legal framework. Therefore, within promotion, we decided that it is necessary to develop a common legal framework. How to design such a legal framework? The easiest way is to build on the existing legal framework. So right now, as I mentioned already, we have some international law, a lot of EU law, and many things are also regulated at national level. However, we have a problem since the EU legal framework on which a lot of the electricity sector is based will no longer be applicable to the UK after Brexit. For the offshore grid, it is the best if all North Sea states can participate, also the UK. Therefore, we have to look beyond only the existing legal framework and think of something that could include all North Sea states. We have developed a solution called a mixed partial agreement. And this type of agreement is an agreement under international law, so it is like a treaty. It encourages the participation of all states around the North Sea, or at least all states that are willing to cooperate in an offshore grid. But the interesting part about this type of agreement is that also the EU itself can participate next to the relevant coastal states. In the rest of the presentation, I will call this the North Sea Agreement. What should be included in the North Sea Agreement? First of all, the aim, the purpose, and the guiding principles of the Meshed Offshore Grid. It is very important that the states around the North Sea all have a similar idea in mind of why we are building this grid and on what values and principles it should be based. If the states differ in their opinions about this, this will lead to trouble when the execution of the grid, when the grid will have to be built, gets there. So it is important that states are all on the same line about what is the aim and the purpose of the grids. Secondly, there are some problems with the interpretation of the law of the sea. It matters a lot whether a cable is called an interconnector or a cable to connect offshore wind farms. And as I mentioned already before, the idea of the offshore grid is to combine these two functions into one. However, then the question is, what kind of jurisdictions do states have on this type of cables? Is it like interconnectors or like offshore wind connections? The states need to make sure that they have a common interpretation of the law of the sea on this topic, so that they all agree about how much jurisdiction they have over the cables in the North Sea. Third, the governance structure of the meshed offshore grid should be treated in such a North Sea agreement. So the governance structure could be, for example, a high-level conference, which takes place annually or biannually, which takes the big political decisions. But then lots of decisions are not so big, but very important and very technical, for example, or economic. And the idea is that you could make a committee structure to treat these technical, economical, and spatial planning questions. And then when political decisions arise in these committees, they can be scaled up again to the high-level conference. Another idea could be to introduce the secretariat. And the secretariat could, for example, help to guide the day-to-day business, but also to prepare the meetings and to make sure that continuity of the grid is ensured. This governance structure is not made up out of nowhere. It is actually based on other mixed partial agreements that exist for specific regional areas. So we looked, for example, at the Rhine Convention that exists for the governance of the Rhine, and the Alpine Convention that exists for the Alpine region. And they both have a similar structure. Then the governance contents are also important. How will decision making be organized? Do you need a qualified majority or a simple majority to make a decision about the topic? This type of issues needs to be addressed in the agreement in order to make sure that the countries agree on this topic beforehand, before they start making the grids. Also, topics like how do you organize coordinated grid planning, which is very important for the cost-efficient rollout of the grids, should be addressed in the contents of how the governance is organized. Another topic is regulatory supervision. The offshore grid will, like the onshore grid, be a natural monopoly. This means that there's no real competition between the grid owners, because you're not going to build two types of grids next to each other in the sea. But this also means that you want to supervise what is going on. You want to make sure that the grid owners keep themselves to tariffs, for example, that they have fair conditions for connection. And for the onshore grid, this is made sure by regulatory supervision by the national regulatory authorities. And the question is, how should this be organized for an offshore grid? We looked at different possibilities. We looked, for example, whether one super national authority should be organized that takes care of the entire grid, or whether this role should be attributed to ACER. But in the end, we found out that the best way to go forward is to make sure that the cooperation of the national regulatory authorities, which is already taking place, should be fortified. Then another topic that should be addressed in the North Sea Agreement is conflict resolution. We hope, of course, that the countries and the grid owners and the connected parties do not get into conflicts. But if they do, it is important to know how conflict should be solved. And almost every agreement has a clause in it that says how conflict should be solved. So this was what should be in the North Sea Agreement. However, some things do not have to be in the North Sea Agreement, but could be better kept on an existing level of legislation. but they could still be improved. For example, as I mentioned in the beginning, the operational rules are very important, but right now they are not all adjusted to the idea of a meshed offshore DC network. Currently, the operational rules are to be found in the network codes, the EU network codes, and then they should be adapted to allow for DC networks. The details on how they should be changed exactly can be found in the work package 11 of promotion. But what we suggest is that the operational rules should be kept in the network codes rather than that they should be adopted one-on-one in the North Sea agreements, because this is way too technical to adopt in the North Sea agreements. However, what we do recommend is to adopt a clause in the North Sea agreements that will allow even the countries that are not part of the EU anymore to still follow the EU rules, so that there's no inconsistency between two sides of the grid about how to treat technical issues. Another topic is permitting rules. Right now they are based on national administrative law. The permits for the construction of an offshore electricity cable or a converter station, they currently already represent a large hurdle to developers. It's a risk if the permit is not granted or if the law changes in between when you are halfway through the permit granting procedure. So especially for cross-border projects, this is a large hurdle. We don't suggest that permitting rules should all be adopted in the North Sea Agreement, but rather that they should be kept on the national level, but that they should be streamlined so that North Sea cross-border projects can be permitted with relative ease compared to how it is currently organized. Finally, decommissioning rules. The current decommissioning rules are based mainly on the offshore oil and gas sector, but it should also be discussed what should happen at the end of the lifetime of wind farms and what should happen at the end of the lifetime of the offshore grid. What we see is that wind farms have a lifetime that is currently a bit shorter than the grid itself. So wind farms have to be removed after 25 years, whereas the grid could live up to 40 years. The question is then, should you remove the grid if you remove the wind farm, or should you build a new wind farm in the same place to use the same connection? Or should you do something else, for example, base this on a case-to-case analysis? In short, the rules are not very clear yet. What we think is, first of all, that more research is needed. For example, we don't know yet enough about the ecological effects of offshore wind farms, and also specifically about what grows on the foundations of offshore wind farms. So the ecological effects of removal are also not yet known. And what we think is that when more research is done and when it is clear what the rules should be, guidelines should be made at international level. Because they are currently at international level, they can best be kept at international level. So to cut everything short, a North Sea agreement should be drafted. It takes a long time to draft such an agreement, so we should start soon. The contents of the agreement, we have some ideas that I just let you know, but not everything needs to be in this agreement in order to make it work. Thank you.